Welcome to another special encore edition of Fair Folk at Work. Well, we've fixed the technical issues that plagued us the first time, and I have remembered to hit the play button. So hopefully this will go better. This introduction worked the first time and I liked it, so I'll repeat it again. You know, for some people, fair is a brief yet intense period in their life. For others, it's part of a larger continuum of who they are. My guest today is more of the latter. His name is Simon Spalding. Simon, welcome.
Good afternoon.
But before we get to how fair has been part of your life in one form or another for most of your life, I need to ask the first Fair Folk at Work question, which is, who was the person who said to you there was a thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
Well, initially, I attended fair as a patron twice. The first time was in 1968, so I was 11 years old, and I went with my parents. But I went in costume. I think my parents were in modern clothes, but I went in costume because we had a theater costume handy, and so it had been a Hamlet costume, but it had been various other roles at different times. So I came in costume the very first time, and of course that was in China Camp, I believe. It was not Black Point, and then I went again, and this was at Black Point with some of my friends in high school. That was in 1972. So I was
So,
aware
what
of.
kind of 11-year-old has a Elizabethan Hamlet costume in his closet ready to go?
I came from a theater family. My parents actually met through the Little Theater scene, as it was called. I mean, now I guess you would call it community theater, but they call it Little Theater in San Francisco. And in fact, they got together because they were cast as the leads in a play called A Phoenix Too Frequent by Christopher Fry. It was directed by Sidney Walker, who's better known as an actor and better known in New York than in San Francisco. They got together through that. And a year and a half later, along came me. So my parents had me acting in shows at the two San Francisco little theaters that were close to our house, the Playhouse Theater, which is on High Street and Beach. Then half a block over was the Interplayers. They were once one theater company, but they split up, I think, in the early 50s. So I had child acting roles in a production of Jean Ennuy's Thieves' Carnival. I was the child in that. I was Canisius Jr. in a production of Lysistrata. And when we get to music, we can bookmark that. Something happened in that production of Lysistrata that kind of inspired some of what I did later. And then the most ambitious thing I was in was an adaptation by A.J. Esta, who was the theater manager of Henry James' novel Turn of the Screw. And I played Miles, the boy, in that. That was probably the most lines I ever had to learn. And then a few things after that, in the summer of 67, the summer of love, my father ran a program for teens. At that point, he was teaching drama and English at APG and Indy Junior High School. And he got AJ Esta to agree to let him do a teenage theater workshop at the Interplayers. He called it Interteens. And Laurie Feldman and I, who had been the children in this production, Turn of the Screw, did the balcony scene. We actually had more lines to learn than any of the teenagers. And I was 10 and she was 8. But at that point, we'd both been in a number of productions. So we were not only the youngest members of that, but also the most experienced. So that's the kind of household that has Elizabethan clothes hanging in the closet.
Can I ask for a thumbnail resume for each of your parents?
Neither one is living, so there's no opportunity to interview them now. My father was born in Bronx, New York. He came out to, well, he spent a year studying abroad, 6 months in Florence, Italy, and 6 months in Heidelberg, Germany. Came back. He got involved in theater. He was involved in modern dance and fencing. This is all before World War II, by the way. This is late 30s. He was involved in children's theater and community theater in Los Angeles. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He learned to fly. He was a B-25 pilot. Flying is one of his big lifelong passions. He was flying aerobatics into his early 80s, actually. Real passion for flying, real passion for theater, and a real passion for history. That's my dad. My mother grew up in San Francisco. In fact, on her mother's side, her people go back to the gold rush. I think she's like a fourth or fifth generation San Franciscan. She also had a passion for theater. Went to the Brattle Theater in Boston for a while. I think she was officially working as a props mistress, but doing whatever she could on the side. She was also very active in Little Theater in San Francisco. The poet Weldon Keys wrote a play where one of the characters, it was one meant for my mother, I think it's called The Waiting Room. I don't know if you know San Francisco poets, but Weldon Keys wrote a role for her in a show which once in a long while will be performed called The Waiting Room. She was in lots and lots of productions. Just my parents ended up cast as the leads in a production together, and that was how they got together. And if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be here. And then they continued to do that through the 60s, which is how I got to do child acting, because they were still active in the San Francisco Little Theater movement. ACT opening up in San Francisco actually kind of dealt a blow to the little theater scene. More people were going to the ACT shows and not the shows at the Interplayers or the Playhouse or the Committee or any of these other community theaters. I'm pleased to say I think the Berkeley Repertory Theater actually did a lot to kind of revive little theater in the Bay Area across the Bay. But by that time, my dad wasn't really doing theater anymore. My mother still did some way up in Sonoma County at the Camp Meeker Players. She after decades of acting, she finally directed a show, which was the Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie. When I was, let me think, I just turned 17. Her production of The Glass Menagerie at the Camp Meeker Players in Sonoma County. Supposedly, there was someone who was going to do the music. There are some very specific music cues that Tennessee Williams calls for, specific songs that were popular at the time. And whoever it was who was supposed to do the music a week before opening night, turns out the person hadn't done anything. The theater manager was like, oh, well, I guess you're not going to do the show. But I told my mother, hey, I think I could come up with something. And so by this time, I was really focused more on music than on theater, but I understood theater having grown up in it. So I created, I couldn't really compose a score in a week. So what I did is I composed major themes, a theme for the mother, Amanda, when she's reminiscing, a theme for the Glass Menagerie itself and for Laura's somewhat complex personality. My dad and I went down to Sherman Clay down on Kearney Street, got a copy of All the World is Waiting for the Sunrise. And I made up a few other themes. I made up a theme that was sort of for the Depression when Tom is talking about, what it was like in the 30s. And I put those themes and everything in between. I just kind of improvised. But I had my major themes for the specific places where music cues were called for. And so I did that.
Sorry
I improvised.
to interrupt. I'm not quite following you. Were these themes played live, or were they recorded and queued up and played when they were supposed to be played?
I played everything live for each show.
What instruments did you use?
The violin primarily. The Glass Menagerie theme I made up, inspired by, but not the same as, a theme from Gabriel Fauré, the French composer's Pélias and Melisson. I made up a banjo theme on the 5-string banjo that I played for Amanda's reminiscences. There were some of the sort of Depression era music I played on a tenor banjo. Those were the three instruments. As you know,
the fact that you mentioned so many instruments sort of brings me to my next question, is that in many ways you, play a lot of musical instruments, and obviously you were doing them at age 17. What was the attraction to you at age 17 to learn how to play so many musical instruments?
I think part of it was growing up in San Francisco, which is a very international city, with somewhat international parents, especially my dad. My dad spoke several languages, and we had family friends that spoke those. I'd hear him talking with the landlady in Italian every morning. I'd hear my friends at school speaking to one another in Cantonese during recess at school. So I think hearing all these sounds of different instruments inspired me to some degree. I did mention when I did Lysistrata, that was where I first met Francis Koshelev, who plays Russian music and other styles of music. He had designed and built an instrument of his own, which he used for his role in Lysistrata, playing live in each show. That's really the fun way to do things. But I've been in the pit orchestra for lots of community theater musicals here in New Bern, and it's always more fun, in my opinion, when the music is played live.
Let me go back to the original question and rephrase it and see if I can get a slightly different answer. Every kid in San Francisco in your neighborhood heard Italian from the landlady and Chinese from their classmates, but you were the one who said, there's a lot of musical instruments out there. I want to learn them. So, what was unique to you, you think, that made you go down that path?
Uh, it's hard to say, but I think that combination of being really interested in music and really interested in history, the interest in history from both of my parents, and music and theater are closely related areas. And I came into contact with musicians like Francis Koshelev through doing theater with my parents. I think maybe it's because I got started playing musical instruments also as a child. My parents were not musicians, so I didn't have quite the hands-on coaching and instruction that they were able to provide me in theater and in acting. But by my early teens, I think I was coming around to the idea that I thought music was more fun than acting. I know that by the time I was in junior high school, I really felt that way. Either playing music composed by others, I was already interested in the idea of creating my own music. And I think my interests were maybe more international because of growing up in that international place. So why did I learn to play the erhu? And I didn't, but I also learned to play mandolin. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe the influences are still there. I know when I cook, most of my cooking is either Italian or Chinese in style.
I'm going to make a transition here, and I hope it makes sense. But I have a great aunt who's from Puerto Rico, and she was a music teacher. I remember her telling me that she speaks three languages: English, Spanish, and music. Do you find that to be true in your brain as well?
To some degree, I dream in music sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people have earworms, but I find sometimes, and in fact, I have since I was a teenager, sometimes I would dream in music more than in verbal language. I do know with foreign languages, when I'm first arriving in a country like France or the Netherlands, those are two places where I ended up picking up the languages on the fly. At a certain point, I would start dreaming, not just in English, but in Dutch or French. And at that point, I would notice that my conversations during the daytime were a whole lot easier. It's almost as if the mind in sleep is processing the language, and in the dreams, I'm trying to find my way through situations.
Do you find that there's commonalities in how any language can be structured and how music can be structured?
They have a lot in common, but there are also differences because words represent concrete concepts,
Mm-hmm.
and music, as some people like to say, where words fail, music speaks. Music is less specific. So I can't ask someone the way to the train station by playing my violin. However, one can express feelings one has that maybe exist without specific concrete concepts.
Okay. Does English country music lend itself to any particular expressions? If I'm making myself clear.
I
If
think you mean English country dance music.
yes, right.
Yes. Okay. Well, it has a different idiom than Scottish and Irish music too.
I don't know why I'm pursuing this, but
That's all
can
right.
you articulate what the differences are between English, Irish, and Scottish idioms?
All right. I can because I've got my fiddle. So,
Okay.
all right. So here's a really typical English country dance tune that is from John Playford's English Dancing Master of 1651, and which you hear a lot at fair.
So that was English country dance music going back to its earliest written documentation.
Right. Yeah, that's a
And how
genuine.
does that differ from Scottish or Irish, what we consider Renaissance-ish, if that's a word?
What we perform at fair for all three of those repertoires derives from different historical sources. With the English music, we have this treasure of John Playford's publications of country dance directions with the music, starting from 1651, and then every few years after that, way up into the 18th century. And dance scholars can use that to show how English country dancing changed over that period. And the dances and tunes that are mentioned that are in Playford are mentioned in English literature going further back into the late 16th century, right into the Fair period. When we look at Scottish music, Scottish piping, especially in the pibroch tradition, there are tunes that go back to this period, but the pipes have a range of only 9 notes. Pibroch tradition was originally harp music that was eventually played on the pipes when the harp became less in use in Scotland. And there's not a whole lot there. It's not very danceable music. So when we're looking at Scottish dance music, we start to get that written down in the 18th century. People started writing down Scottish dances more in the early to mid 19th century. So with the Scottish material, we don't have as much material to go on that goes back as far as the English material. And then with the Irish material, Irish harp music began to be written down in 1790 by Edward Bunting, but we don't start getting collections of the dance music played on the fiddle and the Irish pipes and the flute until the mid 19th century with the Petrie collection, and then later on the O'Neill collections. So with the Scottish material, sometimes what we're presenting at fair, we're wearing clothes representative of pictures of mostly Highland Scots from that period or close to that period. But the music we're playing is more from the 18th and the early 19th century. And the dances we're doing may go back to that period, but weren't written down until the 18th or early 19th century. With the Irish tradition, we have to work with even more recent material because the dances and the tunes that go with them weren't really written down until about the mid 19th century.
When you were saying that, I wrote in big letters, harp, question mark. I'm trying to imagine somebody dancing to a harp.
And there's descriptions of people doing it in Ireland, interestingly enough.
Is that why they have such soft shoes so they don't drown out the harp?
Well, I would say that when they were dancing to a harp, they probably were wearing soft shoes, or if they were indoors, they could even take their shoes off. There is hard shoe Irish dancing, also step dancing. We've performed that at fair a lot, but it would be difficult for people to hear the harp. That's an interesting question, and there's multiple answers may be possible. Does it matter if somebody 20 or 30 feet away can hear the harp if the dancer can hear it and dance in tune to it? We're so performance oriented, we feel like if they can't see it or hear it 20 feet away, then why do it? But I think the aesthetic, 200 to 500 years ago may have been different.
Can we hear you play some examples of both Scottish and Irish dance music as they are currently heard in Renaissance fairs across the country?
Absolutely. Here's a Scottish strathspey, which is a reel that's slowed down and played with a slightly dotted rhythm, followed by a reel.
that was really nice.
Yeah. So you want to hear something Irish now?
I do.
All right. So here's a medley of a hornpipe and a double jig and a reel. And of those, the hornpipe probably, in my opinion, came to Ireland sometime after about 1780 or 1790, because hornpipes in the rest of the British Isles existed before that period in 3/2 time, but all of the Irish hornpipes we have that I'm aware of are all in 4/4. So that kind of suggests that the Irish got the hornpipe sometime after about 1780, 1790. The jig, the double jig, that's a jig in 6/8, may go back further. The reels may go back further still. We don't know.
Can you say the same thing only using your fiddle?
Hornpipes, when they're first written down in England, for example, and there's hornpipes written down in Wales as well. The ones from before about 1780 are all in 3/2. Want to hear an example?
Sure.
Here's a Welsh hornpipe in 3/2. That's the roaring hornpipe. That's a Welsh hornpipe in 3/2, written down about 1750. Now, by the 1780s, you get hornpipes like Fisher's, or the college hornpipe that many of us know as the sailor's hornpipe. Those are in 4/4.
Okay.
So in England, after about 1780, people pretty much stop writing hornpipes in 3/2. There's a few that survive in Scotland, but they're rare. And they're writing hornpipes in 4/4. And there are hornpipes, for example, in Sweden and in the Netherlands that are in 4/4 also. So I'm guessing that the Swedes and the Dutch and the Irish all got the hornpipe after that transition from
Got it.
3/2 to 4/4. Okay, got it now. Good. So to me, that suggests that Irish hornpipes, which I love, which I have played at fair a lot, probably didn't exist prior to about 1780 or 1790. If they had been writing hornpipes in Ireland earlier, they probably would have been in 3/2. I'll play you an example of an Irish hornpipe. Now, we were a 4/4 hornpipe, an English one might go. Well, you take that rhythm and you slow it down a little bit and you make it slightly dotted, then you can get an Irish hornpipe.
Well, thank you very much. That was very nice. And it makes your point a lot easier to understand as well. Now that you got your fiddle out, if you could, for Irish, Scottish, and English music, sort of give me some examples up to 5 of songs that give you joy to either hear or play. And why don't we
Yes.
start with English just to
All
keep the
right. Well,
pattern
I
going?
played Gathering Peskins for you, which when we did this interview the first time, we talked about one of the last times that I got to play music with Dave Ricker and Bob Thomas together. We played that tune, and I had a harmony that I'd made up that thought sounded really nice. And with Bob's bagpipes and Dave and I on fiddle and me harmonizing the second time round and doing a descant the third time round, it sounded really good, to the extent that Dave turned over to me. It was we were playing it for the kids at Workshop in the Woods. He turned over and said, we really ought to record that sometime. But I said, yeah, we really should. It sounds good. And sad to say, we did not. And just a few years later, that wouldn't have been possible because Bob Thomas's that set of bagpipes was burned up in the house fire that Bob and Mary had. And just a few years later, Bob was gone. And, shortly after that, so was Dave.
What other English country dance music gives you joy?
All of it, really. I know you want a top 5 list. I think
Yeah.
I'm going to just rattle off the top of my head, and I'll probably miss some of my favorites. I love Parsons Farewell. I love Newcastle. I'm very fond of St. Martin's. Now we're only up to 4. Let me give you a 5th one that's a real favorite. Heartsease.
Can you articulate for me what is common of those 5 songs that brings a smile to your face?
They're well-crafted tunes, and they go with really neat dances. I think when I play the tunes, I'm visualizing the dances. It's just, there's some English country dance tunes that are very monotonous. Half Hannikin comes to mind. It's very, very repetitious. And those 5 that I mentioned, they're all interesting melodies. They're well-crafted melodies.
That stand up to repeated listening?
Right. Playing on the in-yard stage or Ben Jonson 10 plus times a day. In the early 80s, there was a group of musicians who were known as the Suicide Squad. To be a member of the Suicide Squad, I mean, there was no, it was a very informal thing, but we were all musicians that played more than 10 shows a day at the fair. And these are half-hour shows. You figure out how many hours the fair is open. You're pretty much playing your instrument most of the day.
Who were other members of this squad?
I'm so glad you asked. Avis Minger, David Miles, the drummer.
And what did Avis play?
Avis Minger was a fiddler.
Okay.
David Miles was a drummer. Stacy Toy or Trevenant, who played recorder. I think John Berger didn't play 10 plus shows consistently, but he did a few days, so he was considered part of the club too. I think that was about it. You see, the musicians who aren't on the list, it might be interesting to consider. Dave Ricker and Brian Delarmy, they played for Pipe and Bowl Morris and for Newcastle Country Dancers, but only for them. So they would end up playing like 6 or 7 shows a day. If you're playing 10 plus shows a day, at least at fair in the early 80s, you were probably playing for Scottish show. If there was a Scottish show, you were probably playing at least some of the Irish shows. You're basically, and most of those shows happened on either In-Yard or Ben Jonson. So you didn't have to have quite as many long trips up that back road along the fence to get to the stage. It was called Caravansary at one point. Actually, it was Lydian Grove back in the 70s and was renamed Caravansary. But that you could at least get to that stage still walking along the fence. But those are the people that were in the Suicide Squad, played for multiple shows. I mean, not just with Newcastle Pipe and Bowl, not just Merry Pranksters. Avis and I and David and Stacy played for all of those groups, all of their shows. And then I also I wasn't directing the Scottish show anymore, but I was still playing in the Scottish show when there was a Scottish show, and I was playing in any Irish show that they had as well, at least some of their shows. We actually had, remember those little ceramic heart pins? I still have my Suicide Squad heart pin. The colors are black, red, and white, and then in gold it says 10 plus on it, and I think it has a skull and crossbones. Yeah, I still own it, actually. I have it right alongside a purple heart that was there was a competition for Ring Out, and there was one year that by this time there was the guild system. St. Cecilia's Guild won the Ring Out with a wonderful, wonderful music that was composed by John Berger that we performed. And I got those two those are the only ceramic heart pins that I still have, but I've kept those two because they're special.
I think a big theme implicit in what you're saying has been a sort of commitment to historical reenactment. I should preface this by saying you have experienced historical reenactment as a profession later in your life post the fair. Speak to me about where this commitment to historical reenactment has come from, and what did you learn at fair about historical theatrical reenactments that you have replicated elsewhere?
Well, I think fair taught me a lot. The whole idea of getting people to speak using archaic speech, which here was a name that I didn't mention last time and I will mention now, is Dick Bagwell. Dick Bagwell created the BFA workbooks and classes that all of us learned. And I know some entertainers have kind of joked about them, like this thing that we had to do, we had to learn how to do this. What's the point of that? Well, I think there's a lot of point in that. And I've also attended interpreter training at Plymouth Plantation and seen there, they go into even more depth. And some of the sources for what they do at Plymouth were sources that I think Dick Bagwell accessed, or they use some of the same sources there. There's a connection between those in trying to create an approximation. That's the most it will ever be, an approximation of how people spoke in an historical period, or avoiding expressions and referring to things that were unknown in the period you're portraying. Let me correct you on something. You're suggesting that I sort of took fair, did fair and then left fair and went to do character interpretation and train other people to do character interpretation in museums. It's not as simple as that. There's actually more of a back and forth, because by the mid 80s, I was interested in working in museums, maybe using some of the abilities at role playing that I developed at fair. And so I started doing special events at museums where they would want someone who could play music from a specific time and place, but also interact with the public as a person from the time and place. That grew partially out of my experience at fair, but it also grew out of the summer job I did in 1980 as a tour guide on Alcatraz for the National Park Service.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there and say, what does a tour guide do on Alcatraz that sort of influences fair?
You have an hour and a half to impart historical information to people while you're making the 140-foot elevation gain up to the cell house, and then you're walking around the tour. By the way, they don't do this anymore. Now there's recorded tours you can buy and put on your headset and listen to it all. But when I worked there as a seasonal park ranger in 1980, the whole idea of having guided tours of Alcatraz was fairly new. We had a massive training manual with tons and tons of information, more than you could ever impart to one group of 50 visitors at a time. And then we spent a few days going on each other's tours, and then we did it. If you're a street actor at fair, you may be trying to communicate something to people about Elizabethan England. But if you're in character, you're doing it as a person from that time period. If you're a docent or a tour guide at an historic site, you're also trying to communicate information to people about specific people in a different time and place. So I think that's the connection. But as far as my work, through the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of back and forth between what I was doing for museums and historic sites and what I was doing at fairs, primarily the California fairs, although I also directed a group of people who portrayed the kind of village militia at the Texas Renaissance Festival. By the way, we did dancing, English country dances at specific times of day, and singing and all of that. So I think really through the 1980s and 1990s, I'm kind of moving back and forth through different worlds. And what I'm doing in those different worlds is informing what I do in other places. So in 1987, when I came up with a proposal to create an environmental area at Master Spalding's Academy for Aspiring Gentlemen, which later on combined with what had been the children's dell to form, working with Cage Baker and Linda Underhill, Miss Amanda's school.
I'm
Uh,
sorry, this is at Fair, right?
Yes, this was at
Okay.
Fair. A program of the Living History Center, who still owned the fair. That was when I created that environment. That someone had a famous quote: "How does it feel to be Phyllis Patterson's tax write-off?" Because I was at that point, I was, instead of working for the fair as a musician, I was working for the Living History Center as an educator and creator of an environmental area and teaching people. And the Living History Center, under the direction of Phyllis Patterson, is paying me to teach people about navigation and the sciences. And to do that, I had studied up on the sciences as understood in the 16th century. I had been studying navigation technique for some time, but I boned up on navigation. I researched a character using my own name, but a character who spent a lot of time in the Netherlands. And then I would do these gigs outside of my booth for the Guild of St. Michael's. Some of the members of St. Michael's wanted to dance, and they'd meet me at the Well, which was close to where my booth was that year. And I'd fiddle, and I could prompt them through some dances. That was something I learned to do, to prompt dances while playing. I knew that dance masters in the historical period did that. And then I saw Dave Ricker do it at Workshop in the Woods. I thought, well, if Dave can do it, I can do it. So I developed that degree of stereo brain where you can prompt the dance while you're playing the tune. That's something I've used for dances of other historical periods in my work for museums. So really, there's been, with my history work and I've had two parallel careers in music and in history, and I've combined them in different ways in different places. And the fair was one of the first places that I did combine them and had opportunities to create more than just a performance on one instrument, but ensemble performances, starting with the Dickens fairs in 74 and 75, creating actual shows that combined people role playing with the music and dance, starting in 1978 at the Northern Fair, somewhat under the aegis of Ian McKenzie and Clan McCollin, and then creating environmental areas really starting in 1987 with when I came back with that proposal. And that was the proposal when you talked about Phyllis's, did Phyllis ever intervene for me? And I know that she did on that nobody knew what to make of my proposal to have an environmental area where I just taught both fair participants, but especially fair visitors, about Elizabethan life. And I think a lot of people are just like, what is this thing? And I am told, it wasn't in my presence, but other people told me that when they were discussing this, whether this was something they could do, that Phyllis said that she'd seen lots of proposals from me over the years for music and dance shows, and that she had said, if Simon says he can do it, I think he probably can. Let's take a chance on it.
Let me again push you a little on that and ask you to articulate, what do you think was the mandate behind Chipping Under Oakwood, and how did you replicate that elsewhere?
Well, I didn't replicate it elsewhere. I just
Okay.
took skills that I had developed there and took them elsewhere. Chipping Under Oakwood, I think that's easy. The illusion is there's a small English town somewhere in south central England that happens to be holding a market day, which is why you have all these booths and vendors, and just happens to be on the way of Queen's Progress, so which is why you get to have the Queen pass through it. So that's the illusion. I don't think any of the other fairs I've worked ever recreated in as much detail that illusion as the California fairs did while they were being operated by the Living History Center. I'll say that for openers. And so what I did at a few other fairs, training up groups of volunteers to portray different kinds of people, and by the way, teaching them dances and songs and all that, because that's something I do. Those were maybe, little glimpses of the magic that we had in Chipping Under Oakwood that I was taking other places. And by the way, the idea of character interpretation, which I did at various museums that I worked for sometimes just for a couple of weekends a year, such as Pennsbury Manor in Pennsylvania, a couple different sites in Minnesota, including the Oliver Kelly Farm, and then Half Moon. One of the times I left the fair for a while was to direct a museum based on a reconstruction of Henry Hudson's Half Moon. I got a whole ship to work with, which is kind of fun. Not just a facsimile of the Golden Hind aground on the Ben Jonson stage, not just a smaller model of the Golden Hind parked on a wagon chassis in front of my booth, but I actually got to work on a whole ship and be in charge of it and train the people there. We didn't do a lot of first person interpretation there, but we did some. And then when I went to work for Tryon Palace, by that time the fairs were changing. This is 1998. I had been contracting for the Palace seasonally in December since 1990, but in 1998 they offered me a full-time job, and so that's another time that I kind of disappeared from the fairs. And that time, 1998, I didn't come back because the fairs in the meantime changed. They were already changing during the 90s when the fairs themselves were sold to REC, and then when the Living History Center kind of faded into the sunset, a
Can I
venue for
interrupt
them.
for a sec?
Yes.
I think you identified perfectly two of the three themes that I really found useful about Agora and the fairs of the Pattersons, and why it is so, in a sense, easy to replicate fairs elsewhere because the concept can be explained so easily. It's market day, the Queen's coming, and the third element is have fun. You are here to go to pleasure fair, and everyone is here basically to have a good time and maybe buy some stuff and maybe say, huzzah, God save the Queen.
Yeah.
But have fun was an explicit sort of command. And
Yeah.
what the fair did was break down whatever barrier between the audience and the participants was, and to say, you're here to have fun. The way I describe it is if you want to do a fair, you just say, it's market day, the Queen's coming, have fun, go. And there's really not a lot of, and within that framework, you can do pretty much whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
No one's there saying, oh, you can manage a booth if you're over 30 years old and have an MBA from Wharton or something like that. I mean, if somebody wants to set up a tug of war competition in the middle of the street, they just set up they get kind of permission. And
Right.
if somebody wants to do in a Scottish show, I'm not doing the math right, but 19th century English tunes, and they make them look sort of Irishy, they're going to go, okay, go for it. You
Well,
know,
write a proposal. I mean, that was something, because I also write pretty effectively, that was a skill that I had to begin with. And that was really useful. Back in the mid 70s, when I wanted to get hired as a musician for 75, I think I wrote a one-page proposal
mhm.
for, hey, I have this music group. This music group could play in Fezziwigs. We can play every kind of dance music you need in Fezziwigs. These are the people. These are the instruments they play. This is how much you need to pay them. And so, starting in 1975, I delivered written proposals for pretty much everything that I wanted to do at Fair. That helped a lot. I think that was why Ian McKenzie in 1979 had me negotiate with Ernie Caswell and Dennis Day. The four of us all sat down together and worked out the budget for what the Scots wanted to do, how many stage that we were going to do, two main stage shows that were going to include piping and fiddling, Highland dancing, Scottish country dancing, and Irish dancing. All that was laid out in a written proposal that I wrote. And
I'm sorry,
certainly,
I perhaps overstated my freedom of the fair because, as I recall, we had to do a proposal, and I think usually Mark wrote it, and we had to audition, even though we had done. Hmm?
you say we Mark Wallace. Which Mark? Which
I'm
Mark
sorry,
was?
Mark Sellen.
Oh yes. Oh great. Okay. Good.
But I was thinking more of what we did on the street rather than the stage. I think, but it wasn't quite as loosey goosey as I implied. I'm sorry.
Well, because you had Mark, but some of the groups that I was with had me.
Okay.
And then I remember for the proposal for the environmental area, I thought they need to be able to visualize this. So I do a little picture of myself under a wedge tent that was pulled up with a sign and with navigation instruments hanging from it. And I remember it was funny because when I drew the picture, I hadn't bought the tent yet and I hadn't made the navigation instruments or any of that. But somebody in administration, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, your booth looks just like that picture that you gave us. And I'm not a great artist, it was a funny, slightly cartoony kind of picture. A lot of these groups, your group had, Mark, various Irish and Scottish groups, and then ultimately myself with my environmental area. I had myself writing the nuts and bolts proposal, and I know that's a real asset. People who are just part of the groups that Mark led or I led maybe didn't see that side of it, but that side of it was always there.
Looking back especially, I agree 110%. So thanks, Mark and Simon, for talking to the fair for all of us. And on a somewhat related note, when you are talking to the fair and coming up with a budget for your shows, how did you what was your sort of internal cost sheet between dancers and musicians and actors? I was sort of coming up from the stage side of the equation where everybody basically got the same.
Well, there are. I wouldn't say that all those distinctions are meaningless because people who play musical instruments take them out to this hot, dusty, placing the strings and replacing their
Right.
reed.
And then there
And
are better musicians than others, and ones that'll show up pretty consistently, and ones that
right,
won't.
I'm always happy to pay musicians more than I paid dancers.
Yes.
Sorry. I was comfortable with that. It was kind of neat that some groups, like Pipe and Bowl, for example, dancers got paid, I think, about the same as the musicians. I think I mentioned in 1979, Doug Berger invited me to join Pipe and Bowl as a dancer, and I was, with some reluctance, had to turn it down because that was the year that the Clan McCollin started doing a main stage show, which I was directing, and doing our own workshops before fair. That was what I was committed to. So I stayed with that. Well, it's an interesting idea. Different compromises are worked out different places.
Now, you have been in musicals and performed professionally and written and produced and arranged things. What do you find is the difference, if any, between a fair and a non-fair musician in terms of being able to adapt to different environments?
I came already from a background
Mhm.
theatrical. Like when I was directing these shows at fair, I was also part of a touring Russian music group called the Massenkov Russian Folk Festival. And I played in that band. I actually didn't play fiddle. I played contrabass balalaika, which is a balalaika the size of a small car. But that group was like that too. And then we'd go on tour and we'd be playing one night stands in different locations, flying to all of them. Sometimes we go straight from the airport to the tech rehearsal if the plane was late and wouldn't get to our hotel until the little bit of time we had between the tech rehearsal and the performance. So I was performing on that level, with that group, the Massakoff group. We played in Carnegie Hall. We played on the Darna Shore Show. We did pops concerts together with the Honolulu Symphony, the San Francisco Symphony, Baltimore Symphony, and the London, Ontario Symphony, not London, England. So I was playing music with groups like that for these short little tours we did in between and around what I was doing at fair in like 1979 and 1980, and then booking European tours for groups of musicians I put together, and then playing venues in Europe, and played some pretty big venues over there too. I think I was already to some degree doing music in that sort of way,
Right.
as well as at fair. Maybe that made me well qualified to direct these big music and dance shows because I wasn't afraid to say, okay, we're going to do it my way. Your way might be good, but we're going to do it my way. I don't think I did that very often, which is probably why I stayed around fair. It didn't end up being tarred and feathered and run out on a rail. But I certainly had the capability to say, no, 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 this is how we're going to do it. I'm smiling a little bit because someone I worked with in fair shows was Terry O'Neill, who is an Irish dancer, was many things, but among other things, an Irish dancer, and he played tin whistle. And he was in a lot of the groups that I played with. At various points, he teased me for running, as he put it, running the Clan Collins show with an iron hand. But he said the iron hand implies the velvet glove. And so I was, working with people at fair. I think I could be tactful. It's just but behind the tact, there was always that willingness at a certain point to say, we're going to do it my way.
I'm kind of running out of questions, but before we go,
Well, you'd
could
asked
you?
me about who nurtured me along the way at fair, and I gave you a list of people. I'd love to give you that list again.
Okay, but let me ask my question first,
By
because
all means.
I'm going to be the editor. If you were to, and again, getting back to Joy, compose a sort of all Renaissance fair band, you sort of mentioned some names already, Dave Rickert and people like that. Who would be on your all Renaissance fair band? Just people you just want to sit down and play with.
Dave Ricker on the fiddle, Bob Thomas on the pipes, Brian Delarmy on the fiddle, Avis Minger on the fiddle. Nice to have Stacy back on the recorder. Certainly Dave Miles on the drum. There's some other excellent drummers too. Robin, there was a drummer named Robin, a guy named Robin who played drum. He's, going down the list, I'm sad to think that most of these people are deceased now. But I'd love to have Mark Sellen fiddling. I would love to have Richie Van Healy playing. Just it's fun to have him along too. At various years, I found people like, oh, who's this new person with a violin? Oh yeah, I play in an orchestra over there, and I go, hey, how'd you like to be part of our show? We can pay you whatever you're making. We can also give you another $15 a day and some food tickets. I've incorporated people into shows I did at fair, and just very much that way. Who's that person? Oh, yeah, he can really play. Hey, you want to play on our show? It'd be great to have Dick Bagwell either on his pipe and tabor or a tin whistle or recorder. I'm sure once we're done with the interview, I'll think of names of other people that I should have included. But those are some of the musicians I really, really enjoyed working with over a period of many years. There are also some excellent musicians that were in a show that I was part of or that I directed for a couple of years, but then they stopped doing fair, and they were just as good musicians and just as fun to work with as the others. But those names that I came up with, those are people I worked with over a period of years, in some cases even decades.
And what was the question I interrupted that you were going to answer?
You asked me, well, who are the people who encouraged you along the
That's
way?
right.
I'd like to answer that question again.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, when I first auditioned, age 17, to be a pass the hat musician at the Dickens Fair down on Army Street, Eileen, the director at that time, I don't remember her last name. She was the entertainment director for both the Renaissance and Dickens Fairs. Eileen, she let me do an audition together with Maria and gave us a pass the hat license and 3 food tickets a day. And that was great. I was just out of high school and looking for gigs. Then she was replaced by Peg Long. Peg Long was another person who appreciated a well-written proposal, and you could sit down and talk with her. And she was really good at saying, well, here's what you proposed, and that's great. Here's what I need. Can we make these 2 things fit at this budget? And I remember having that kind of conversation many times with Peg. It's great to be able to negotiate with someone like that. Then Peg was replaced by Ernie Caswell and Dennis Day. I remember that conversation during workshops in 1979 when I took over the stage shows and the in-camp crafts and other things for Clan Colin. It was Ernie and Dennis and Ian and myself and kind of ironed out the details of budget and what was going to be done. Dick Bagwell, he was someone who really did a lot to help create what became Chipping Under Oakwood, starting way back in the 70s, before I even started doing the fairs. Like in the early 70s, he developed the basic fair accent classes and handbooks. He portrayed Will Kemp. He's actually was a leading person in reviving the pipe and tabor, the one-handed pipe. You play the tabor with the other hand. And he and I I could tell you stories about the first time that we actually introduced ourselves in fair, and it was in character, and I got to be gobsmacked. Not the Will Kemp, where I knew who Will Kemp was. It's like, here's this well-dressed man who plays a pipe and tabor, and he's just introducing me. He's Will Kemp. And that was a fun interaction. And then he and I both worked a little Renaissance fair on the periphery of New Orleans together. And that's a fun story if you've got time for it, how we ended up being the two Californians working this fair in New Orleans. Oh, and then moving on in time, Linda Underhill. I cannot say enough how much I appreciated Linda Underhill as a director, as a mentor, as a colleague. She was one of those people who really could imagine things and make them happen. Like Bagwell, almost a generation early. Dick was imagining people all speaking some version of Elizabethan English, coming up with a course to get people to try to speak in a somewhat Elizabethan way back in the early 70s, and made that happen. Linda had great vision of how to use people and resources to create, both at the fair and at Workshop in the Woods, these really magical experiences. So Linda is one of my very favorite people to work for and with at the fair. It goes without saying, but I need to credit Phyllis. At various points, Phyllis Patterson herself was the person who put the seal of approval on proposals that I had. I was told that at least one of those where no one knew what to make of it, but Phyllis said, "Hey, let's give it a shot. He's got a track record with us, and if he says he can do it, I think he can probably do it, and it will be good." And she would come by, especially when I started having environmental areas, so I wasn't just this musician flitting around like I was when I was in the Suicide Squad. She'd come by my booth. She'd tell me what things she particularly liked about what I was doing. You asked if she'd ever admonished me. She never did, actually. I'm pleased to say, I think she liked what she saw. What I did get from Phyllis sometimes, as I also got from Linda, was, "What you're doing is great. Can I get you to develop this? Can you work with somebody else to do this, to re-rig the Golden Hind on the Ben Johnson show?" That was a Phyllis thing. Linda and Phyllis were really good about that.
Can you remember any other Phyllis and or Linda specific suggestions?
Well, I remember a compliment I got from Phyllis was she was putting together, I think she was putting together some kind of dream team to do something. I don't remember what it was. And she said to me, "And Simon, you always bring such a joie de vivre to everything you do." And I wish I remembered more of the context, but it was such a nice compliment. And I felt like, yeah, you really get me, don't you? I didn't say it, but I thought it. I do have a lot of enthusiasm for the things I do, whether it's in music or history or education. It isn't hard for me to get really fired up about something and work hard on it. I know that was a quality that Phyllis appreciated in me, and she wasn't afraid to express it on some occasions. She wanted to ask my opinions on things. What do you think about what they're doing over there? You think that, is that good? Is that really audience interactive? Is it really fun? Not often, but sometimes. Linda would give notes to everybody, and I think she appreciated that I was someone who could be told once what we could do, not have to be told repeatedly. Because there were people that she would have to tell repeatedly, or people who were unhappy with this or unhappy with that. With me, just give me a place to do what I do, and I'll do it, and I'll do my best. And that's how I've always been about everything I do in all those different areas. And that's a quality that, I don't know, you either have it or you don't. But I chose to pursue these twin careers in music and history because I enjoy them, not because they were how I was going to make the most money.
Can I ask you another question about your enthusiasm?
Yes.
Is it true the first year, I don't know if this is Dickens or Fair, you took 5 instruments as a street performer from your house to the performance venue?
Yes. Yes, I did. That was Dickens Fair 1974. I was a multi-instrumentalist. And so I thought, yes, I brought a fiddle, I brought a mandolin, I brought a 12-string guitar, I brought a 5-string banjo, and a washboard. That's right, all those 5 instruments. And I was carrying all those 5 as a street performer from one place to the other. And then when I came back in 75, I just brought a tenor banjo. And then when I started doing the Renaissance pleasure fairs in 76, it was with a fiddle.
So there was a learning curve.
Oh, absolutely. Very steep one, you know.
You figured that out pretty quick.
After Dickens Fair 74, I would sometimes bring just one instrument, which would be a fiddle. I would sometimes bring a second instrument, which for the Dickens fairs was sometimes a Chinese erhu, an instrument I've played since my teens. For the fair, sometimes it was a cruth, the Welsh six-string bowed lyre. Sometimes I play cruth in camp
Hmm.
or in my booth. It's fun because it's a different looking instrument. It's more common now than it was back in 1979 when I started playing Kruth. But yeah, deciding to do fair with one or possibly two instruments was something I learned after that first year at the warehouse on Army Street.
I'm running out of questions. In the course of this interview, have you had any memories that you have not thought of for a long time? This is sort of your time to do the fill in the blank, or I should have mentioned so and so.
Well, I think one thing about fair, when you mentioned the grandmother from Puerto Rico, and I talked about Avis, the fact that Avis was completely bilingual in English and Spanish, and with her family, her mother and also her sister usually spoke Spanish rather than English. And you knew her at fair, but had no idea that she had that language ability. And I think I also mentioned that she was a graphic designer when I was developing a group to do tours in Europe. She designed our flyers and did beautiful hand drawn artwork on those. I would say this, that a lot of the people that I met through fair were a lot more than what you saw at first on a first impression at fair. Say Bob Thomas, for example. Okay, great musician, busker, but he also did artwork for the Grateful Dead. Some of the really famous Grateful Dead artwork is Bob Thomas's work. I think the fair in its heyday, back when Living History Center ran it, attracted a lot of people who are multidisciplinarians. And so a lot of the people that I met through fair had abilities and talents and sides to their personality that you just had to get to know them to know. Dick Bagwell and Avis Minger and Bob Thomas come to mind, but I'm sure if we sat here and talked about them longer, I'd probably come up with dozens of people like that. And I'm sure dozens of people like that, oh yeah, they did community theater, and oh yeah, they were professional artists, or they did, I think that kind of theater in the round environment where there's music and dance and visual arts and food and all of these different things, some of the booths themselves. I remember at Black Point, when you went up the road a while, there was Wendy Westfall with her cloak booth, and it was right near Chris Caswell's harp booth. And people who played harp would just sit in Chris's booth and play the harp. And it was such a neat environment. It was away from the really big crowds that you get down the Market Cross and the washing well. Be a little bit quieter, feel, you begin to see the trees and the leaves a little more, and these lovely environments that people would create with their booths. I think fair in that era attracted a lot of people who were multi-talented, multidisciplinary, and it was exciting to be a part of that. And having people like that attracts other people like that.
And I think that's a good ending point for this interview. So thank you very much, Simon Spalding.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
So now I find the stop recording button. And that was my 2024 interview with Simon Spalding. I'm your host, Dan McLaughlin, and this has been another episode of Fair Folk at Work. If you have a question or a comment you'd like me to pass on to Simon, you can email me at djng@earthlink.net. If you have questions or comments for me, you can email them to me at djng at earthling.net. And finally, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest here on Fair Folk at Work, you can, yes, email me here at djng at earthling.net. But that's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.